Welcome back, everyone. The unthinkable becomes reality. Words that once belonged to speculation, rumors, and late-night debates have now entered the realm of fact. Crimea is back under Ukraine. For years, this outcome was dismissed as fantasy, a political slogan rather than a strategic possibility. Yet history has a way of humbling certainty, and in this moment, the world is witnessing one of those rare turns where long, frozen assumptions suddenly collapse. When the first confirmations emerged, they spread cautiously, almost timidly. Journalists double-checked sources. Analysts paused mid-sentence. Governments waited before issuing statements, unsure how to frame what they themselves had once deemed impossible. Ukrainian control over Crimea was not supposed to happen, not now, not ever, according to most conventional wisdom. And yet, there it was, unfolding live, impossible to ignore. Crimea had always been more than land. It was a symbol layered with history, identity, pride, and power. Its annexation in 2014 was not just a territorial grab. It was a moment that reshaped Europe's security order and sent a chilling message to the world about the fragility of borders. For Ukraine, it was a wound that never healed, a silent injustice carried into every negotiation, every ceasefire, every appeal to international law. Crimea became the one place everyone talked about, but no one expected to change. Years passed, wars expanded, front lines shifted, but Crimea remained fixed in the global imagination as untouchable. Heavily militarized, strategically vital, and politically sacred to Russia's leadership, the peninsula was treated as a permanent reality. Even Ukraine's strongest supporters often spoke of it in hushed tones as a long-term issue, something to be resolved diplomatically one day, perhaps generations later. What the world underestimated was time. Time wears down narratives. Time erodes certainty. Time exposes the gap between propaganda and reality. As the war dragged on, the balance quietly shifted. Russia's military strength, once perceived as overwhelming, showed cracks. Logistics faltered, equipment aged faster than it could be replaced. Sanctions tightened slowly but relentlessly. Morale wavered. None of these alone could change Crimea's fate, but together they began to reshape the strategic landscape. Ukraine, meanwhile, transformed itself. What began as a desperate defense evolved into a disciplined, adaptive force. The Ukrainian military learned quickly, blending Western technology with battlefield improvisation. Intelligence sharing became sharper, coordination improved, mistakes were costly, but lessons were absorbed. The country did not just fight. It adapted, culturally and strategically, to a prolonged struggle for survival. Crimea's isolation became the key, not through a single dramatic strike, but through sustained pressure. Supply routes were disrupted, key infrastructure came under threat, the illusion of invulnerability began to fade. What was once a fortress started to feel like a liability, a peninsula connected by fragile links and surrounded by contested waters. Each successful Ukrainian operation chipped away at the idea that Crimea was permanently beyond reach. Inside the peninsula, life under occupation was far from the stability portrayed on state television. Surveillance was constant, dissent was dangerous, forced loyalty replaced genuine consent. For Crimean Tatars and other marginalized groups, repression was a daily reality. Even among those who had accepted Russian control, fatigue set in as economic promises failed to materialize and the costs of militarization grew heavier. When the decisive phase arrived, it did not resemble the dramatic invasions of history books. There was no single thunderclap moment. Instead, it was a cascade of calculated moves, each narrowing options for Russian forces. Withdrawal became a strategic necessity rather than a political choice. Positions were abandoned not because they were overrun, but because holding them no longer made sense. As Ukrainian forces advanced, they did so with caution. This was not only a military operation, it was a moment watched by the entire world. Every action carried political weight. Every image would be analyzed, amplified, and weaponized in narratives far beyond the battlefield. Discipline mattered as much as firepower. Order mattered as much as speed. When Ukrainian flags appeared over administrative buildings, the images spread instantly. For some, they sparked celebration. For others, disbelief. For many, a complex mix of emotions that defied easy categorization. In Ukraine's cities, people gathered not to cheer wildly, but to watch quietly, phones in hand, absorbing the weight of what they were seeing. This was not just a victory, it was a validation of years of sacrifice. President Zelensky's address reflected that gravity. There was no triumphant shouting, no declarations of conquest. His words were measured, almost restrained. He spoke of justice, of return, of responsibility. Crimea, he said, was Ukraine. It had always been Ukraine. And now the task was not revenge, but rebuilding trust, restoring rights, and healing wounds carved by years of occupation and war. International reactions revealed just how deeply this moment cut into global assumptions. European leaders expressed support while urging calm. NATO emphasized defense and stability. The United States reaffirmed Ukraine's sovereignty, careful to balance recognition of the moment with warnings against escalation. The language was deliberate, reflecting both admiration and anxiety. In Moscow, the shock was palpable, even through layers of controlled messaging. Official statements avoided acknowledging loss, framing events as tactical adjustments. State media shifted narratives rapidly, focusing on resilience, external threats, and future resolve. But beneath the surface, the psychological impact was severe. Crimea was not just territory, it was a pillar of modern Russian political identity. Losing it challenged years of rhetoric about strength, destiny, and historical correction. The ripple effects extended beyond politics. Financial markets reacted with volatility. Energy prices fluctuated as traders reassessed Black Sea security. Defense sectors surged in some regions, while others braced for uncertainty. The global economy, already strained, absorbed another reminder that geopolitical shocks can emerge where least expected. On the ground in Crimea, reality was quieter, more complex. Ukrainian authorities moved quickly to establish order, emphasizing civilian protection and legal continuity. Messages urged calm. Security checkpoints appeared, but so did efforts to restore services and maintain daily life. The goal was clear: to prevent chaos, to demonstrate governance, to show that this return was not a collapse into uncertainty, but a step toward stability. For residents, emotions varied widely. Some felt relief, some felt fear. Some felt caught between identities shaped by years of propaganda and the sudden reappearance of a state they had been told to forget. Ukrainian officials promised amnesty for those not involved in serious crimes, signaling an intent to reconcile rather than punish. Whether trust could be rebuilt remained an open question. For Crimean Tatars, the moment carried a deeper resonance. Decades of displacement, repression, and silenced voices culminated in a cautious sense of hope. Leaders spoke of cultural revival, legal protections, and long-delayed justice. Their presence in discussions about Crimea's future marked a shift from marginalization to recognition. Legal experts worldwide weighed in quickly. Many pointed to the moment as a reaffirmation of international law, arguing that occupation does not erase sovereignty, no matter how long it lasts. Others warned that legal clarity would mean little without sustained security and political will. The challenge, they noted, was not declaring Crimea Ukrainian, but keeping it that way peacefully. Strategists began rewriting assumptions. If Crimea could return, what else might change? Frozen conflicts long treated as permanent suddenly looked less fixed. The lesson was unsettling and inspiring at the same time. Power, it seemed, was more fluid than many had believed. China and other global powers watched carefully, offering measured statements while analyzing implications for their own strategic calculations. The precedent of territorial reversal, achieved through sustained pressure rather than sudden conquest, raised questions that extended far beyond Eastern Europe. For Ukraine, the road ahead was daunting. Integrating Crimea meant addressing years of legal ambiguity, rebuilding infrastructure damaged by war and neglect, and managing economic reintegration. Property disputes, citizenship issues, and social divisions would test patience and governance. Expectations were immense, and disappointment could become dangerous if progress stalled. Yet the psychological shift was undeniable. Ukrainians had proven to themselves and to the world that endurance mattered. That resistance was not futile, that history was not closed. Veterans who had fought since the early days of the conflict saw their sacrifices acknowledged, though never erased. Families separated by borders began to imagine reunions once thought impossible. The broader war did not end with Crimea's return. Frontlines remained active, risks persisted, escalation was still possible, but the narrative had changed. The sense of inevitability that once favored occupation was broken. The idea that force could permanently rewrite borders without consequence took a serious blow. Social media amplified everything, spreading images and claims faster than facts could always keep up. Governments urged restraint and verification, aware that misinformation could inflame tensions. In this digital battlefield, perception became almost as important as reality. As days passed, the initial shock gave way to reflection. Historians drew parallels to moments when entrenched beliefs collapsed overnight. They reminded audiences that history rarely moves in straight lines, and that what seems permanent often rests on fragile foundations. Night fell across different continents, but the same images glowed on screens everywhere. Ukrainian flags in Crimea. Soldiers standing watch, not celebrating, but guarding. Civilians navigating a new reality shaped by uncertainty and cautious hope. The world remained stunned, aware that this was not just a headline, but a turning point whose consequences would unfold for years. The unthinkable had become reality, not through a single dramatic blow, but through patience, pressure, and persistence. Crimea was back under Ukraine, and with that return came a powerful reminder. History is not finished, borders are not beyond challenge, and even the most confident assumptions can be overturned when reality decides otherwise.